Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us for this event, which is entitled Instrumentalising Citizenship and the Fight Against Terrorism. How have deprivation powers evolved since 9/11? My name is Tendayi Achiume, and I'm the inaugural Alicia Manana Chair in Law at the UCLA School of Law. And I'm also the United Nations Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. It's really a pleasure to be your moderator today. And I'm joining you from Los Angeles, where I'd like to acknowledge my presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabriela and Tongva peoples. The event today presents a new joint report by the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion and the Global Citizenship Observatory at EUI. And this report provides a global comparative analysis of legislation on deprivation of nationality as a national security measure. And it also marks the publication of the finalized commentary to the principles on the nationality deprivation as a national security measure. Together, these two resources offer a global picture of the current state of play of nationality deprivation powers and how these have evolved since 9/11, as well as an in-depth international law analysis of the measure. As the report notes, recent years have seen a resurgence of states' practices of nationality deprivation as a national security measure, repackaged for the 21st century as a counterterrorism instrument. And from the perspective of my mandate, I'm especially interested in the finding of the reports because these measures too often are deployed in a discriminatory fashion. While the use of citizenship stripping as a security measure remains hotly contested, the human rights consequences are scary, they are clear, and require urgent attention. And so this report could not come at a more timely moment. And the rigorous empirical analysis that it provides, I think, will be a really powerful contribution to policymakers, to civil society advocates, to everybody as we try to move forward in a more just fashion. So I'm not going to take up too much time with my introductory remarks. And what I'd like to do now is give you a sense of the format of the event and then turn over to our speakers today. We're going to have two speakers who will present some findings from the reports, and then we're going to have two discussants who will then respond to them. And what I'm going to do is just briefly introduce our speakers today, and all of them have extensive bios that you can find online, and then turn it over to them. So speaking first will be Martin Vink, who is the co-director of the Global Citizenship Observatory and the chair in citizenship studies at the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute. And after Martin, we will hear from Laura Van Was, who's co-director of the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion and also assistant professor at Tilburg Law School. And then for our discussants, we'll hear from Anne Charbord, who's an international human rights lawyer focusing on human rights and security and the senior legal advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. And then our final commentator will be Berkay Mindarachi, who's an expert on Turkey at the International Crisis Group and covers both internal security and a number of foreign policy issues. And among the issues he is specialized in is policies related to ISIS returnees. So with that, I'm going to, without further ado, turn it over to Martin to get us started with some findings from the report.
Thank you, Tendayi, and good afternoon, everyone from Florence. I'm delighted to present here today, together with Laura Van Was, the results of our joint ISI GLOBALCIT survey of legislation on deprivation of nationality as a security measure around the world, with a particular focus on the post-9/11 context. Apologies. Now, in our report, we find that 79% of the 190 countries we studied have at least one type of security-based deprivation ground on their books. Most countries provide, in fact, for 2 or 3 of these different deprivation grounds. And there is a clear trend of increasing prevalence and greater applicability of nationality deprivation based on broadly defined disloyalty security concerns, especially in Europe and the MENA regions. The picture is more mixed elsewhere. And this is problematic, we argue in the report, for at least 5 reasons. First, citizenship stripping undermines the security of the most fundamental legal status one can obtain. Second, it is often implemented with sufficient safeguards against statelessness. Third, in practice, this leads to arbitrariness, second-class citizenship, and discrimination against minorities. Fourth, it threatens the international legal order and relations between states. And fifth, it risks normalizing denationalization as a legitimate power for states to hold over their citizens, with a knock-on impact for efforts to protect the right to nationality. Now, in this short presentation, I will briefly introduce the scope of the report, what kind of deprivation grounds are covered, and then I present some first results of our global comparative analysis, focusing on global prevalence and a closer look at the most common type of security-based deprivation powers. And Laura will follow up on this and present evidence about the recent trend, as well as international standards and responses. Now, in our report, we take a broad approach to surveying the prevalence of security-based nationality deprivation. So what actually is this security-based nationality deprivation? We cover in our report the 4 deprivation grounds which correspond with the relevant modes of loss of citizenship as covered by the Global Citizenship Law dataset that was launched at the end of last year. And this dataset covers the legal situation on the 1st of January in 2020 in 190 countries. And for this report, we have updated the most commonly applied deprivation ground to 2022, and also compared this with the legal situation on the 1st of January 2000. I would like to give credits here, in particular to my colleague Luc van der Baren, who has worked with me on this within the Global Cit team, and of course to our ISI colleagues. Now, the most commonly applied deprivation ground is the first one that you see here. It's a ground that broadly refers to involuntary loss of citizenship by a person due to behavior or offense that is based on the concept of disloyalty or harm to the interest or security of the country. When you look at all these nationality laws in these 190 countries that we surveyed, you find, of course, different phrasings of these provisions. And some may not refer specifically to security, but what matters is that these provisions can be potentially used to deprive citizens of their nationality based on manifest disloyalty or harm to the interest of the state. And then we also include, besides this disloyalty provision, 2 grounds that refer specifically to military or other service to a foreign country. And the first ground, military service, is of course directly related to security and relevant currently in the context of foreign citizens who join the military conflict in Ukraine. Maybe we can go into this in the discussion. Whereas the second provision can relate, for example, to security or intelligence positions abroad, or even to a broader range of political or administrative positions. Again, these need not necessarily be related to security, but they can be used for security-based deprivation. And finally, we also cover deprivation on other typically criminal offenses. And it's important to capture those provisions as well in nationality laws that refer not specifically to security concerns, but are based on convictions for certain types of crimes or crimes with certain length of imprisonment. Okay, so let's go to some of the findings from the report. And when we look at these 4 deprivation grounds, as you see here in the plot in front of you, there are in fact 40 countries, 21% out of the 190, where no security-based deprivation ground is prevalent in the law. It doesn't mean that there cannot be other deprivation grounds due to voluntary acquisition of citizenship abroad, or voluntary renunciation may be possible. But this also means that in about 80% of the 190 countries that we study, at least one security-based deprivation ground is present. We see that in 53 countries, 2 of these 4 deprivation grounds are present in the nationality law, and in 46 countries 3, and in 19 countries even 4 grounds. Yeah, this means that the security-based deprivation powers that we study are really very prevalent around nationality laws in the world. Now, when we break this down by region, and when you go to the annexes that are available with the report, you can also play with these data yourself and look at other kinds of categorizations that you may be interested in. We see, first of all, that that there is strong variation between regions. Secondly, in the MENA region, we see that there is the strongest prevalence of deprivation grounds. 8 of the MENA region countries have, in fact, all 4 of these deprivation grounds, and it's least prevalent in Americas as well as in Europe. But as Laura will tell you, in Europe this has been increasing. Now, when we further look at the prevalence of these particular types of provisions, we see that the most commonly applied provision is, in fact, the disloyalty and treason provision, which is typically a very broad provision and may not be precisely defined, and therefore gives a lot of discretion to administrations to deprive people of their citizenship. This is in fact present in almost 70% of the 190 countries we studied. The other deprivation grounds are less prevalent, but still between 30 and 40% present in a wide range of countries. Now, when we zoom in a bit more closely at these disloyalty provisions, we look at a couple of elements in the report, and let me highlight here 3 elements. The first one is, are there sufficient safeguards against statelessness? Even if a state deprives somebody of their citizenship, they shouldn't lead to statelessness and leave somebody without any form of citizenship. And in the report, we take a rather narrow definition of statelessness, which means that we look at countries that have explicit safeguards against statelessness mentioned in the nationality law. And we find that, in fact, only in 36 out of the 134 countries, we find very clearly defined and explicit safeguards against statelessness. In the other 98 countries where these kind of deprivation provisions are prevalent, we do not find such explicit safeguards against statelessness. Second, this I think is also, just like the lack of statelessness safeguards, prevention safeguards, a very problematic observation is that these deprivation grounds typically apply only to a subset of citizens and not to all citizens. Only in 34% of countries where those deprivation rules are prevalent do they apply across the board to all citizens. In 66% of countries, they apply to a specific subset of citizens. These may be naturalized citizens or people who have acquired citizenship on any kind of specific acquisition ground. But typically, these would apply to people who are not a citizen from birth, so people of immigrant or minority background. Thirdly, and I'm about to close, when we look at the procedural elements, how does this deprivation take place? We see that, in fact, that in the far majority of countries where this is practiced, loss does not take place automatically. And this is a good thing because even if deprivation in itself is problematic, where it occurs, it should be done with due regard to individual circumstances, considerations about statelessness. And we see that in the majority of cases, there is room in the procedure for these considerations to take place. And they typically would take place by the minister or by governments, but in fewer cases, these would be considerations taken into account by courts. Of course, courts subsequently may be able to scrutinize decisions by the administrations. Okay, so a brief snapshot of some of the first findings from the report. Thank you for your attention, and I give the floor to Laura.
Thanks so much, Martin. And before Laura begins, I forgot to mention to everybody that we are expecting a really robust Q&A portion as well to allow all of you to put some questions to our participants. So please go ahead and start populating the Q&A function or the chat with any questions that you might have. So when we come to it, we can add those in. Thanks, Martin, and I'll turn over to you, Laura.
Thank you very much, Tendayi, and thank you, Marta, for kicking us off so well. Also, before I forget, just to say a huge additional thanks, not just to the team at GLOBALCIT who's been working on this analysis, but also the team within ISI. It's been many months of work trying to make sure that we were as accurate as possible in undertaking this massive exercise, and we're really excited to be able to present the findings today. So it falls to me to talk some more about what we've called the longitudinal study portion of the report. Essentially, one of the things that we wanted to understand is how much this issue has resurged in the 21st century. What we have seen as a general observation, if you look at media reporting, if you look at the work of commentators and academics who are discussing policy change, if you look at some of the legislative change that has been reported, you see that in the period since 2000, after the September 11 terrorist attacks in the United States, and during a period marked by the rise and fall of ISIS, that there has been this shift in thinking on citizenship and on deprivation of nationality in particular. There's been a general trend of what's been described as legislative fever around counterterrorism. Justifiably, states have been looking for ways in which to ensure security for their populations. And it's within this context that you have started to see the emergence of a very unexpected vocabulary really in Western states, where citizenship became something that was talked about as a privilege rather than a right. And this is quite a dramatic shift as compared to the second half of the 20th century, where denationalization was really seen as a tool of authoritarian governments. So we wanted to really measure how much citizenship stripping has come back into play as a national security measure. And this is the picture that emerges. What it shows is that there is a clear trend of increased prevalence of nationality deprivation in laws relating to disloyalty writ large. If you look at the global picture, 1 in 5 countries have added new grounds for nationality deprivation that relate to national security or counterterrorism, etc. Half of these actually did not have any such powers on the books in the year 2000, showing that it really is a marked shift. I should note that this plot only shows it plots each country that has reformed. But in fact, some countries have enacted multiple reforms over this period, including the Netherlands, Denmark, Australia, and the United Kingdom. In the UK, in fact, a 4th law reform is currently being considered in Parliament. And already the cumulative effect of successive amendments introduced from 2002 onwards has been to expand powers, to increase the scope of who can be targeted, to bestow more discretion on the Home Secretary in the use of nationality deprivation, to weaken judicial oversight, and to erode procedural protections. Now, the UK sits within Europe, which emerges in our report as the epicenter of expanding powers. More than half of the 37 countries globally that have amended their legislation to that effect are in Europe. And over half of these countries in Europe have added terrorism as an explicit ground in their laws, directly making this link between new deprivation powers and national security and counterterrorism measures. The other region that has seen significant reforms is the Middle East and North Africa, where 8 countries expanded their deprivation powers since the year 2000, equating to around 44%, in fact, of countries in the region. There too, involvement in terrorism was added as a specific ground for deprivation of nationality in a number of these countries. Importantly, though, the survey also revealed a counter-trend. So there are 15 countries globally where existing powers to deprive nationality in relation to disloyalty have been either repealed or significantly constrained over this same period. What's more, 2/3 of countries have actually not amended their laws on this point at all. This means that in the majority of countries worldwide, deprivation powers, if they exist, remain unchanged since the year 2000, including in numerous countries that saw a significant number of their citizens join ISIS, such as Jordan, Tunisia, and Russia. Today, there are 56 countries globally that do not provide in their laws for citizens to be stripped of their nationality for disloyalty, national security, terrorism, etc. This list includes Canada, where deprivation powers were introduced in 2014, but then removed 3 years later because of a successful campaign around the idea that the citizenship of every Canadian is devalued when it is made conditional for anyone. The list also includes Trinidad and Tobago, which repealed its nationality deprivation powers in 2000, prior to the rise in global terrorism. It then passed anti-terror legislation in 2005, 2010, 2018, without bringing back citizenship deprivation powers. This is noteworthy because Trinidad and Tobago was among the countries with the highest numbers of nationals per capita traveling to Syria and Iraq as foreign fighters, constituting the highest proportion of ISIS recruits in the Western Hemisphere. Also highlighted on this slide are Sweden and the Czech Republic, 2 countries that have bucked the trend in Europe. Proposals were aired by politicians in both of these states to bring in citizenship deprivation powers in response to the challenge of dealing with ISIS returnees, but these did not receive support and no legislation was tabled. In fact, in the Czech Republic, as in Poland, Slovakia, Croatia, and several countries in the Americas region, there are actually constitutional protections in place that prevent involuntary loss of nationality, helping to ensure that the protection of this right from it being instrumentalized. Now, while the report's main focus is on legislation, we also canvassed readily available data to see how deprivation powers have been used in practice by the countries in which they've been introduced or expanded. What we found is that the lack of reporting on data makes it hard to gauge how much the measure has actually been used. But the few available statistics suggest that the numbers affected are relatively low. Cases are in the tens or less, with the exception of Bahrain and the UK, as shown on this slide. We also found that some states, for example in Central Asia, where nationality deprivation powers were introduced explicitly to address the perceived threat of foreign fighters returning from Iraq and Syria, do not appear to have used these powers. Rather, they have focused instead on repatriation, rehabilitation, and de-radicalization in their response. Turning from data to concrete individual cases, we also took a look at who has been targeted and the circumstances of the case. Now, there's been something of a media frenzy around the case of Shamima Begum, which means that many are familiar with her story and to some extent with what happened to her after she was stripped of her British nationality. But what happened to other denationalized citizens from different parts of the world? What we discovered is a variety of complex outcomes following nationality deprivation, as the 4 cases on the slide highlight. The case of Neil Prakash, stripped of citizenship by Australia while serving a prison sentence for involvement in terrorist acts in Turkey, demonstrates that citizenship stripping may just result in moving the problem around like a hot potato, as one security expert has described. Responsibility of dealing with such individuals is passed to another state, in his case, Turkey, a country that has felt the brunt of other governments' recourse to nationality deprivation of foreign fighters who joined ISIS. The cases of Fatima H, Hisham R from the Netherlands, and Kamel Daoudi from France show that even this outcome is not guaranteed, as the governments that serve these deprivation decisions remain encumbered with the problem of what to do with these former citizens, now in limbo back on their territory. The killing by drone strike of Mohammed Sakr and Bilal al-Badrawi demonstrates that the withdrawal of their British citizenship, and with it the protection of the state, can precipitate very serious consequences. In none of these cases is citizenship stripping an easy fix to the complex challenge of combating international terrorism, despite what some politicians would say about the measure. Indeed, when the wider global trend towards increased instrumentalization of citizenship stripping as a national security measure is distilled down to the level of an individual case, the practicalities of what is involved in it and what follows from nationality deprivation are laid bare. According to security experts that are critical of the use of nationality deprivation in the fight against terrorism, states that have embraced this measure are essentially avoiding the tough but necessary responsibility of dealing with their own citizens. Counterterrorism experts warn that nationality deprivation will be counter-effective to security goals, as this quote on screen shows. The UN General Assembly and the Security Council have called on states to bring terrorists to justice. Whenever states, by means of depriving a person of their nationality, expel known terrorists from their territory or prevent their return, they fail to investigate and punish terrorist action. By doing so, states also lose effective control over these individuals, which significantly complicates monitoring and prosecution. This exporting of risks is at odds with durable global security, while also violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other states. So what's the way forward? The widely endorsed principles on deprivation of nationality as a national security measure and the accompanying commentary, which is published today in its finalized format, provide a framework to guide states on how to effectively navigate this issue in line with international obligations. These principles provide an authoritative overview of existing international law standards. They apply to all situations in which states take or consider taking steps to deprive a person of nationality as a national security measure. As the report launched today shows, the evolution of nationality deprivation powers has not escaped the attention of human rights actors. UN mandate holders have expressed concern at specific countries' policies or reform plans. They've also intervened in individual cases to call for respect of international law standards. We've also shown that in the regular monitoring of state practice through the UN treaty body system, recommendations to states have addressed a variety of different concerns that nationality deprivation powers raise under international law, including the avoidance of statelessness, the principle of non-discrimination, and the prohibition of arbitrary deprivation of nationality. While there does remain significant room for improvement in the measure of attention devoted to the issue, there is a clear foundation to build on. International law protects the right to a nationality for a good reason. Citizenship stripping instrumentalizes exclusion, but it is inclusion that brings the greatest benefits, not only for democracy, equality, and the rule of law, but also for social cohesion and indeed ultimately national security. Even if the number of individuals directly impacted by nationality deprivation remains relatively limited and the powers brought in some states remain unused, the resurgence of citizenship stripping has a corrosive effect on the most fundamental legal status you can obtain, a nationality, which is also protected as a human right. This instrumentalizing of citizenship in the fight against terrorism risks normalizing denationalization as a legitimate power for states to hold over their citizens, with a knock-on impact for efforts internationally to protect the right to nationality and to prevent statelessness. We live in an era of rising authoritarianism, growth of the security state, increasing populism, xenophobia, and racism, and citizenship is under threat in countries around the globe in ways not seen for generations, not only in this counterterrorism context. As more states treat nationality as a privilege that can be taken away at the discretion of the government, the prospect for successfully protecting against arbitrary deprivation of nationality, as provided for under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is progressively eroded. As our report launched today concludes, it's imperative to call a moratorium on the use of citizenship stripping in the fight against terrorism, and for states that have these powers on their books to urgently reconsider the appropriateness of instrumentalizing citizenship stripping in this manner. It's time for those states that recognize nationality as a right to lead the way in challenging the post-9/11 expansion of nationality deprivation powers. Human rights and security actors also have a common cause here. They need to strengthen their engagement on this issue, making the case now against instrumentalizing citizenship stripping and for the benefits of inclusion. We hope very much that the evidence that we've gathered through this report will help to frame and inform these actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Laura. And thank you also to those of you who've started to put your questions through to the chat. I encourage others of you to do the same. But before we turn to our Q&A, we're now going to give our discussants an opportunity to engage with the findings of the report. And I'd like to start with you, Anne, and ask you what you make of the picture that emerges from this report in terms of the global prevalence of nationality deprivation powers and as they relate to national security, and specifically the fact that more countries have adopted such powers since 9/11.
Thank you very much, Tendayi. And let me also maybe just quickly start by thanking the organizers, the ISI and the Global Citizenship Observatory, for inviting this mandate to take part in the launch of this report. The Special Rapporteur very much regrets that she's unable to be here today, but she knows that the continued cooperation the mandate has with you on these issues will continue. Let me start by saying what a truly important and timely report this is. It brings to the discussions very much needed facts and analysis that we will be able to use to deepen our engagement on the issue of deprivation of citizenship. The mandate has been engaged on this issue for the past couple of years, and we have just a couple weeks ago issued the mandate's position paper on deprivation of citizenship as it applies in Northeast Syria, because it's indeed through our work on Northeast Syria, and in particular on the question of the repatriation of third country nationals from the camps and the prisons there, that the mandate has started to engage on this issue. So you might know that we're a very small team. And although we were certain that there was clear and regressive trends in state practices of citizenship stripping that were being justified by policy arguments related to counterterrorism and security, because we were made aware of numerous cases and situations where this occurred, we were unable to grasp the extent of the problem, partly because that we're a very small team and we didn't have the capacity to do that, but also because of the nature of such measures and the fact that comprehensive statistics remain elusive. As we saw it, however, the prevalence of the phenomenon was clearly illustrated by the trend of states to adapt their legislation to lower the legal threshold for deprivation of nationality, with the express intent of targeting those perceived to be associated with designated terrorist groups. So the report undeniably confirms these findings and brings much needed facts and figures. I just want to highlight a few that really struck me in reading this report. In the period, and Laura mentioned some, in the period between 2000 and 2022, 37 countries added new grounds for nationality deprivation that relate to national security or counterterrorism. That's 1 out of 5 of the countries studied. In half of the countries introducing new deprivation powers, these are expressly linked to terrorism, even where there has been no conviction. Europe is where the most of these laws have been enacted, which is something that we had noticed. 18 countries are concerned. And lastly, and for the mandate I work with, this is quite an important finding. The report notes that there has been an acceleration starting an acceleration between 2006 to 2022, but an acceleration after 2011 and after 2016 again. So the link that is made to the implementation by member states of UN Security Council resolutions, in particular those on foreign terrorist fighters, is important because it shows yet again the negative impact that the lack of human rights analysis of the implementation of these resolutions at national level can have. In many states, as the report clearly shows, citizenship stripping is done through administrative decisions implemented directly by the executive power without any or very little judicial oversight, often based on intelligence information. The report notes that in only 14 countries, deprivation is to be ordered by a court. Now, this is another important finding for us, because we have often noticed the increased use of administrative measures in countering terrorism by member states. So maybe just a few very specific points that I want to make specifically in relation to Northeast Syria. First, some facts. Persons who are subject to citizenship deprivation in Northeast Syria include large numbers of women who are deprived of their liberty in the camps and who have dependent children. Persons subject to citizenship deprivation in Northeast Syria particularly comprise single-parent female households. There are over 18,000 single-headed female households in these camps, and 61% of the population in these camps is under the age of 18, 47% is under the age of 12, and 24% is under the age of 5. We have found deficiencies under each of the criteria that must be respected to prevent arbitrary deprivation of citizenship as it is applied to Northeast Syria, namely conformity to domestic and international law, the need that the deprivation serve a legitimate purpose, the question of proportionality and necessity, and the existence of sufficient procedural safeguards. So we're aware of several instances where an individual detained in Northeast Syria has been deprived of one nationality only to have the state of their second alleged nationality disclaim their citizenship, which in practice renders the individual stateless and stranded in the camps in a legal limbo from which there is virtually no possible resolution possible. In some instances where children are born from mothers who have been deprived of their citizenship and where their father is dead or has disappeared, the children can be left stateless and again in a complete legal limbo. States have engaged in citizenship stripping on a basis that appears primarily to involve the prevention of their and possibly of their children's return to their country of citizenship, which, as you know, is contrary to international law. When coupled with measures aimed at the removal of the individual to another state, deprivation not only impacts on the right to a family life of the person deprived of his or her nationality, but also on the right to a family life of their family members. And this has a particularly serious impact on minor children. For individuals detained in Northeast Syria, deprivation prolongs their detention and exposes them to sexual violence, exploitation, trafficking, harassment, and leaving children in the inhumane detention camps can never be said to be in their best interests. We have also, as the report notes, observed patterns of gender inequality and gendered exceptionalities in the current counterterrorism citizenship stripping practices. This includes the targeting of religious and ethnic minorities with very selective application of citizenship stripping. And these practices, in effect, obviously create second-class citizenships for minority groups whose lived experience of citizenship functions as less stable than it does for the majority or the dominant populations in society. The flagrant lack of procedural safeguards for the men and the women who are deprived of their citizenships while in Northeast Syria is a striking element of these procedures. The citizenship stripping often takes place without any judicial process at all, but when there is, the situations of detention, in fact, prevent any meaningful participation in the proceedings. One's capacity to engage when one is in the camps or in the prisons in any legal process is entirely circumscribed by the conditions that they endure, which the mandate has found to amount to torture and inhuman treatment. Finally, many are stripped in absentia, sometimes simply informed of a deprivation decision through the placement of a physical notice with an individual's file or by sending the decision to their last known address. And such practices render the notice requirement effectively meaningless, as the individual has no way of knowing that they have in fact been deprived of their nationality. Now, the fact that citizenship stripping can actually control and define on security grounds who may legally benefit from family memberships reveals the profound connection that is being forged between family regulation and contemporary security policy, counterterrorism policy. The removal of citizenship status from a family member based on assumptions or claims of radicalization, extremism, or engagement in or support of terrorism affect the fundamental rights of all family members. So while citizenship formally functions as an independent right, for children, there is an absolute codependency between the exercise of their citizenship rights and those of their parents. We've also seen and condemned the practices of some states that are allowing detained children to return to their home country on the condition that they consent to separation from their mothers and or vice versa. This obviously amounts to forced separation in a context where meaningful consent cannot be procured. And we have seen cases where this was the case with the mothers being stripped of their citizenship. So for all of these reasons, the Special Rapporteur has called for a moratorium on deprivations of citizenship in the context of Northeast Syria. I'd just like to make one more point. The report notes a few interventions that were done by the Special Rapporteur, whom I represent here, notably in the case of Shamima Begum, in a Dutch case, which we did together with the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Racism, and one to the UK government highlighting concerns on their Nationality and Borders Bill. I just want to refer to an additional one, which is referred to in the report, in which the mandate has engaged. And that's the case of Mr. Kamel Daoudi, which Laura just mentioned. The mandate recently filed an amicus brief before the European Court in this case. And we found that this was an emblematic case, not just because the case is indeed emblematic in itself. It's a very complicated case of citizenship stripping approximately 20 years ago following a terrorism conviction, assignment of residence ever since. Initially because deporting him would violate the prohibition of refoulement, but then for other reasons such as violating his curfew, etc. So an addition of administrative measures. And what's interesting in this case is that the mandate argued before the court about the lack of proportionality of the various cumulative administrative measures. So we referred to citizenship deprivation, but somehow this was only the starting point, because that was only the starting point of his assignation to residence. And the response of the French government in this case has been very simple. He was stripped of his citizenship. They don't engage on the other grounds. And this shows, in our view, that states feel that this is a very powerful argument to raise. So I'm going to stop here, but maybe just to conclude. And again, as was said earlier, the mandate finds that, like many of the counterterrorism measures that are taken, particularly in Northeast Syria, the current situation cannot be reconciled with any position that states are effectively addressing international threats to peace and security, including terrorism and violent extremism effectively. This is a very ineffective way of addressing this problem. So I'll stop here, but I look forward to the discussion and to any additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that really, really comprehensive engagement with the findings of the report. And I really do want to echo one of the things that you said, which is that I think the report intervenes by bringing facts to a context where facts have been few and far between. And so I think one of the exciting things is that the possibilities that the report opens up for action that before might have seemed unlikely to be taken. So thank you so much for your reflections. And I'm going to turn over now to Berkay to provide some of his reflections on the report as well.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you also for this excellent report, really, which focuses on a very crucial issue. The findings are very interesting, and of course, the acceleration of this trend of citizenship stripping revocation is bad news for Turkey, because Turkey is home to thousands of returnees who came back from Syria and Iraq. Turkey is close to the battlefields in Syria and Iraq. And I think it's valuable to shed some light on how Turkey has been affected and what the practical, also policy implications have been in terms of adding to the difficulty of repatriation and deportation from Turkey. So some brief background on the situation in Turkey. Turkey is one of the countries that is directly affected by the revocation of citizenship practice. After ISIS's territorial defeat, there have been thousands of returnees from diverse backgrounds who ended up in Turkey. Turkish officials say that since 2011, they deported a total of more than 8,500 ISIS-linked foreigners from Turkey. Others have been convicted in Turkey. Today, there are around 1,000 ISIS convicts in Turkish prisons, and also around 1,000 foreigners suspected of ISIS membership or ISIS charges in so-called removal centers. So they are waiting to be deported to their country of origin. And in 2019, among those 1,000 ISIS convicts, they were actually from 40 different countries. So you have quite a lot of diversity also in terms of nationality of people that have ended up in Turkey. Turkey has to release by law individuals that are in removal centers, so they are legally able to stay in those centers for 1 year. And if countries don't repatriate their citizens or take them back, then they have to be released. And there were cases where it actually caused serious security problems, where people have to be tracked, and there were discussions around repatriation. Especially around 2019, those instances are not as common as they used to be. Turkey itself has also become a target of ISIS attacks, as many of you will know. Between 2014 and 17, there were 16 attacks, and there were around 300 fatalities in those attacks. Most of them were civilians. And since then, especially since late 2015, Turkey has improved its security response and tightened security at its border as well. But despite that, of course, the challenge for Turkey in dealing with ISIS-linked foreigners and also Turkish citizens is quite daunting because of the thousands of people that have ended up in Turkey. There are a number of practical problems that the policy of citizenship revocation brings about, and also, of course, security implications with that. First of all, citizenship revocation complicates the repatriation operation itself, which is already quite cumbersome. It's costly. It requires a lot of coordination from a number of agencies, also including. So operationally, it is causing troubles because in terms of obtaining travel documents, ensuring safe transfer of individuals to the country of origin. Second, there are also issues around the identification of true sort of identities of individuals. That is a challenge in itself already. And of course, many people have also obtained fake IDs before they came to Turkey or in Turkey itself. So the practice of denationalization can push people more into that direction, and it becomes very difficult to identify the true identities of people who are being caught on ISIS-linked charges or on suspicion of ISIS charges. And third, this was already mentioned, there are a lot of women that have ended up in Turkey with children, with many children. Some of these children are also adopted, by the way. So children of their relatives have come with some of these women too. And once their citizenship is revoked, of course, there are a lot of questions about what to do with children, what laws apply to them, and with which country to get in touch with to organize the repatriation process, or even to demand the repatriation of these children. So that's definitely a challenge in the Turkey context as well. And finally, denationalization also affects, has a ripple-on effect, I would say, on collaboration with third countries on other security issues. I mean, what we have been picking up is that there is less willingness on part of Ankara, so Turkish officials, to cooperate on criminal issues, on other files with countries that are actually stripping citizenships of their nationals. And that has, so there is a ripple-on effect on sort of overall collaboration with Turkey. Actually, this also applies to other contexts in this area. And information sharing is very critical when there is there is a return operation, and bringing people to justice requires a lot of information as well, also from Turkish officials and from Turkish authorities, basically. But that also becomes more complicated, of course, with countries that strip their nationals of citizenship, which also diminishes their prospects of being tried potentially once they're back in their countries, because there's less willingness, political willingness, if you will, to share information on the process of how people have entered, what they've done when they spend time in Turkey, etc. So that has a knock-on effect, I think, which needs to be considered here. And I mean, looking forward, will continue to be a problem. A lot of ISIS convicts are getting released from Turkish prisons after serving their sentences. The ones that do not commit a crime in Turkey but are charged on membership charges, they usually get a sentence of 4 to 5 years. So that means that some of them will and are getting released right now, and or will get released fairly soon. And that means that this is going to continue to be a problem because once they're released, they are put up for deportation directly. And if their citizenship has been revoked, which has been the case in some instances, then that brings about big questions around where they should be repatriated to. Turkey uses the concept of source countries. So the approach is to send people back to countries that have stripped their citizens of their nationality. And that has happened before, where Turkey has done it with other countries, and countries sometimes have also agreed to do that. So that certainly, once the citizenship of a person is revoked, that is creating a lot of new strains on the repatriation operation and making it much more difficult to do this in an orderly way. Yeah, and then I think it's also worth looking at the sort of how Turkey has been dealing with such a large returnee population. We have written a report in 2020 on Turkish citizens who joined and returned to Turkey, and how Turkey has been managing the inflow of people from Syria and Iraq, also the security strategies that have been employed. And I think there's a lot to learn there, also in terms of monitoring, in terms of how they have been ramping up capacities in the sort of different security services. And it seems to have, they seem to have done quite a lot on that front. And I think there are things to learn out there, and potentially also to understand how close monitoring can be combined with potential de-radicalization or disengagement policies, which in that sense would be interesting, I think, also for countries of origin to investigate more, to understand, to sort of also decrease the fears of returnees and people coming back to their countries, and the security threats and sometimes the perceived security threats around them. Also, finally, I think it's important to look at the example of Central Asian countries, especially Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, which are collaborating quite well with Turkey on repatriation, and they are actively repatriating their citizens. They have put out programs on reintegration as well in their countries, and they have actively repatriated. And it seems like some of the lessons from their experience is that some of these returnees that have come back to their communities, they have actually been multipliers of messages that counter ISIS messaging, and because they have seen what kind of organization they have ended up in, and it has definitely not not been what they had expected when they first went there. So they speak of the horror they have faced there. So they sort of also sometimes become multipliers, discouraging many others to join. So necessarily, like looking at this at your returnee populations only from a very securitized lens and thinking about them as threats and potential risks in terms of new attacks, etc. I think we need to expand that lens a bit more. Also looking at what kind of roles they can play in terms of prevention of potential new radicalization or new recruitment. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you again for this excellent report. We're doing our own report, the crisis group on foreigners affiliated with ISIS in Turkey and policy around them, will be published hopefully within this year. So I will be glad to keep engaging with relevant interlocutors also on this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those insightful reflections, Berkay. And I initially had some questions as the moderator, but I'm actually going to hold off of asking them because we have some really rich questions coming in from our audience as well. And in order to expand the debate, I'm just going to jump right into those. So one of the questions that we have, and what I thought I might do is just put the question to the group, and different people might reflect on the question. So one of the first questions we have is, how realistic do you think it is to call for a moratorium on citizenship deprivation when a number of European states have been gravitating towards expanding their ability to use the measure, as the report itself is noting? And in addition to that, the European Court of Human Rights has unfortunately accepted the legality of a number of denationalizations in the context of the European Convention of Human Rights. And the person who's posing the question actually gives an example of a number of cases where this has been, and this is the findings of the court have been notwithstanding the dramatic impact of citizenship stripping on both private and family life. So I guess the question is to the entire panel to ask about how realistic this call for a moratorium really is, even if we can acknowledge that a moratorium is really important.
I'd be happy to come in and say something, and then I would be interested in others' views on this as well. It's a really challenging question, and I think one of the things that we've seen both at the level of domestic legal challenges against this measure, and indeed also before the European Court of Human Rights, is how much deference has been paid to the national security argument. And also to the expertise of a minister in determining what is in the best interests of the state's national security. And so there has been really a very limited effort to engage with the human rights consequences of the measure, to engage with the discriminatory effect of using this measure against certain citizens while others cannot be targeted. And even to engage with the question of statelessness, in fact, where courts have been hesitant to go along with what is the general international understanding that a person is stateless if no country recognizes them as a citizen. They seem to have been happy to say, well, but the minister says that they're a citizen of this other country and therefore it should be fine. So we see a number of, unfortunately, a number of legal challenges where it seems evident that they should be successful on, human rights grounds or even procedural points. And yet, as I said, a lot of deference has been shown to the executive in his or her wisdom to act in the best interests of national security. And yet, I think that a reason why we can hope for a call like a moratorium, which is perhaps an interim step to the ultimate repeal of powers, is precisely because over the last several years, we're increasingly hearing calls from security experts that the use of this measure is impeding also their work. And so this combination of international legal obligations that really should constrain state powers, but also just the wisdom question. Is it wise to be doing this? We saw this in the context of the Netherlands, for example, where it was the public prosecutor's office that actually spoke up against the use of citizenship deprivation because of concerns that it would remove jurisdiction for prosecution. And that had significant sway in a parliamentary debate here about the extension of powers, which led to the powers only being extended temporarily rather than made permanent. So I think that there are opportunities for a different kind of dialogue that brings together the human rights understanding with a genuine hard look at the security benefits or even counter effects of the measure that allows us to say, well, let's put it on hold and let's evaluate properly, because we've had a number of years in which to see the effects. And then we can undertake a process of discussing whether the measure should remain on the books in the laws into the future.
Thank you very much for that, Laura. Does anyone else want to speak to that? Otherwise, I can definitely introduce a few more questions.
Maybe Tendayi, I can connect this to one of the other comments. So I don't have so much to add to Laura. I think it's the main argument for why we call for a moratorium is the inefficacy of the use of citizenship stripping as a security measure, and I think that's a very compelling argument, and that should become increasingly more clear. I wanted to connect this to Milena's comment, who I think makes a fair comment. Right, so our report talks about citizenship stripping being instrumentalized for security purposes, whereas Milena argues that it could also see this the other way around. Right, so there's actually an instrumentalization of security concerns, and citizenship is stripping is the tool of that. Right, and I think that's a very fair point. So I don't think we would contest this. There are probably two sides of the same coin. But I think your second question there, Milena, is important, where you say, well, if this is the case, then why are the numbers so low, right? If this seems so important, why is it so? Why is it actually not used? Citizenship stripping used so infrequently? And I would bring this in as part of the answer to the general question of the moratorium. I mean, states themselves, of course, also see that this is not effective as a security tool, and this is there are of course good and bad sides to this. So the security agenda, I think it's less effective, but the other side of the coin is more problematic, that actually we see that citizenship stripping is used for other reasons, right? And political reasons. It's used to gain votes, for example, right? And this also plays into the answer to our question. And if I can refer here, Tendayi, also to Maria Gerdes, her question about what's going on in Sweden and Luxembourg, for example, that countries that buck the trend. I think it's important to be aware that these discussions about citizenship and also about citizenship deprivation, they of course are intertwined with discussions about migration and about belonging in general in the country. And these discussions, at least in countries such as Sweden and Luxembourg, they have a different kind of dynamic than in the countries such as the UK, right? Well, this can be good or bad, right? So there's no easy answer to how likely is the moratorium. This depends on the political situation and how this evolves. So on the one hand, as a security instrument, it's clearly ineffective. That means that states should drop it. But from a political perspective, we see that it's also driven by broader agenda. So the way to deal with citizenship deprivation is also to bring in more general discussions about how do we deal with citizenship and migration. And we see that countries such as Sweden and Luxembourg have taken a different road there, but there's also no guarantee that Sweden will not jump on the bandwagon of other European states, right? What we see as evidence over the past years is that there are strong pushes for states to do that. So by calling for this moratorium, I don't think we are saying that this is an easy thing to do, right? But it makes it actually more important to make clear that that there is a problem and that we should address this and not overlook this. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Martin. And thanks also for pulling in some of the other questions that have come in through the Q&A. And with respect to Milena's first question, I thought that I might repeat her question, which Martin, you've begun to answer, but also invite other panelists to reflect on this, because I think it allows for a broadening of the conversation in a really important way. So Milena asked, her question was, first, the title of the report suggests that citizenship stripping is instrumentalized for security purposes, but another interpretation would be that alleged security concerns are instrumentalized for the purpose of getting rid of unwanted citizens. And she says this is an important difference, both in the sense of understanding the motivations of policymakers, and because it raises different normative concerns and might lead us to different conclusions about whether the policy might be justified. And I'd be curious to hear from others on the panel about the connection between citizenship stripping and instrumentalization of national security concerns and the broader political dynamics that may be involved in driving some of these trends. Anne and Berkay, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. Laura, you should also feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I can definitely return back to some of the other questions we have from the Q&A as well.
I mean, we have only been looking at the situation of ISIS returnees, foreigners in Turkey, but yeah, not at the sort of practices of Turkey and stripping citizenship. Of course, an important issue. So I don't have an answer on this.
I don't have much to add to what has been said. I think maybe just to highlight the more general trend that we see in terms of the second part of the question, which is to get rid of unwanted citizens. And maybe just to repeat that what we see, and again, this is from a very small lens, but what we think we see is that governments are indeed using the unproven security threat, because for many of these individuals, the information comes from, I mean, the government basically does not need to prove what it is putting forward in terms of security threat. It's all based on confidential information, and it is very largely kept secret, even where there are legal procedures that look at this question. So an unproven security threat to indeed prevent the return of individuals to countries, to their countries of nationality. And we've seen this, let me just give you one example in which we've seen this. We worked on an individual case with Switzerland. And this case is public, you can find it on our website. And it was two minors who had been taken to Northeast Syria by their mother. And there were legal cases that had been started in Switzerland by their fathers. And initially, the government of Switzerland refused to move. And we weren't quite sure we understood why. I mean, these cases are always quite difficult to take forward, and governments are very reluctant to return their citizens. But what ended up happening was that the government did return the two small girls, and they stripped the mother of their citizenship, and they separated the two small girls from their mother. So I think there is clearly a use of citizenship stripping measures to prevent these individuals from returning, alleging an unproven security threat. Let me just maybe say one more thing. In the case of Shamima Begum, what we found very disturbing was the way that the government was continuously returning to an interview that this minor had given when she was in the camps. So we found that she might have said this, but again, the conditions in which these questions were posed, the situation that she found herself in, both in terms of the material conditions that she was in, but also the risks to her security that was posed by the fact that she was in the camp, was never taken into account. And so we find that the use by the government of this security threat and the alleged links to terrorism, not looking at other options such as trafficking, etc., is incredibly problematic. And it does show that there is a willingness to simply treat these prevent their return and treat them as very much unwanted.
Thank you very much, Anne. So I'm going to move us on to another question that came in, and the person who asked it says, as briefly mentioned by Martin in the introduction, I'm curious to hear your views on the implications of the current situation in Ukraine, whereby foreign fighters are joining combat there. And while it's interesting to see how the term foreign fighters seems to have been positively reinstated in the media, in light of your findings on nationality deprivation of real or alleged foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq, what are or could be the implications of such a decision for these individuals, the decision to fly to Ukraine or travel to Ukraine and engage in fighting there?
Maybe I can also kick us off on this. It's a really interesting example of precisely the conundrum that states face once they start to turn citizenship into some type of policy instrument. Because on the one hand, you have people who have been labeled as foreign fighters, often with the inclusion of terrorist in there, so foreign terrorist fighters who travel to Iraq and Syria, who are to be punished by being banished from their political community. On the other hand, you have a new or a different circumstance of foreign fighters now traveling to Ukraine, and you see states adopting the opposite response. So in Latvia at the end of February, the law was amended to ensure that Latvian citizens would no longer be subject to stripping of their citizenship if they joined the Ukrainian army specifically. It basically added this to a list of exceptions of countries that their citizens could go to join a foreign battleground, essentially. And it shows just how enveloped this measure actually is in broader questions around foreign policy, in the idea that the executive or even the legislator can determine what is a just cause and an unjust cause. And the idea that citizenship is an appropriate tool to deal with any of those types of scenarios, as opposed to the use of criminal sanctions for criminal behavior and national security related measures for actual security threats. This idea that, you know, citizenship can be taken away or protected at will, depending on, you know, the context in which a person is joining a foreign battle. It shows just how challenging this is also to governments if they follow through on this line of thinking. And just in terms of kind of a principled approach, the idea of wielding citizenship as a kind of instrument to stand up for democratic values is in itself a kind of a hypocritical stance, when citizenship is precisely one of the foundational elements of democracy that should be protected from this kind of instrumentalization. So there's a strange sort of dilemma there that also just does not make a lot of sense.
Thanks, Laura. I think others will weigh in. Martin, you've unmuted.
No, I mean, not so much to add, but to mention the case of the UK, right, where there was also that if you bring in foreign policy for citizenship stripping, it makes it very convoluted. Why in the case of Ukraine and not in other cases? We've seen that also these events, Yugoslavia also played a role in the Netherlands introducing or reintroducing citizenship stripping after the Second World War. It was actually abolished because we're in the Netherlands. We wanted to prosecute individuals, so it gets very convoluted. And in the UK, it was apparent that there was confusion when I think it was the Minister of Defense who initially said, well, people can go there and fight. And then others within the UK government said, well, maybe not so fast, because under our current nationality law, this might lead to citizenship deprivation. And Yeah, one would hope that this leads to a broader reflection on the use of deprivation powers for these clauses. Yeah, I think it would be too optimistic to expect too much from this, but it certainly shows the ambiguities in how these powers are currently being used.
Thanks, Martin. Anne, were you going to say something? I think that's definitely a really interesting question. I meant to say something in response to one of the earlier questions that really highlights some of the concerns from my own mandate's perspective. You know, I think it was Martin or Laura who mentioned how the report notes that in 66% of countries, the measures are not applied to all citizens equally, but are reserved for particular categories. And in many of the countries that I'm familiar with, it ends up being exclusions that track national origin, ethnicity, and racialization in very profound ways. And as the situation plays out with Ukraine, it's difficult to resist an analysis that really highlights the use of citizenship stripping to adjudicate who belongs, who doesn't belong, very much in a way that reinforces a sense that nations are racialized or have ethnic preferences in terms of who they're willing to protect and who they're willing to expel. So again, just really expressing appreciation for the fact that your report gives us numbers that allow us to really make sense of what analysis is at stake. I'm going to shift gears to a different question that is raised by the audience participants that I think many may have in mind. And the person asks, do you consider the use, all the uses of other deprivation powers, e.g. on grounds of fraud, as being disguised forms of national security deprivation? And I'm going to add something that this person doesn't ask, which is, is there space based on your analysis to imagine that there can be legitimate cases where citizenship stripping is actually a valid measure that is exercised by the state? Or should we be concerned that even the ones that seem ostensibly legitimate very much lead down a slippery slope that leads us into dangerous territory?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I say something and Laura can follow up. Thanks a lot, Bronwyn, for your question on this, on whether we consider also fraud. And in fact, in the report, we do consider this. So I mentioned in my presentation these 4 deprivation grounds, disloyalty, military service, other service, and criminal offenses. But we do spend about a page or so looking at deprivation based on observed fraudulent acquisition. Right? And this is actually extremely prevalent. It's probably one of the most prevalent deprivation powers globally. So in our report, we highlight that these powers can be used in 89% of all 190 countries. Now, as Tendayi said, there may of course be good reasons, right? If somebody acquired a citizenship fraudulently by lying about residence or individual circumstances, there's maybe a just cause to say that the acquisition is void or can be nullified. But it's also true that this is often highly complicated. And yeah, we do think that also security plays in these considerations. In the report, we talk about the case that ended up in front of the Court of Justice of the European Union, the case of Rothman, right, an Austrian who became German citizen and had not been open about criminal procedures against him in Austria. And so this is, yeah, on the one hand, you can say it's fraud, but at the same time, you can say, well, if there are legitimate reasons for this person, Mr. Rothman, to have become German, why should this particular circumstance void the German naturalization? And that may be very clear if you take a literal reading of the German nationality law, but if you think about it more broadly, it may not be the case, and there may also be more problematic individual cases, and that's why indeed it's a very good point, and that's why we also think that these securitization in deprivation is it cannot be clearly narrowed down to one particular kind of citizenship stripping, and in fact it comes back in various deprivation powers. So that's why we purposely take a broad view to also capture this.
You're on mute, Tendayi.
Oh, I'm on mute. I was saying thanks, Martin, and we have a question that was specifically for Berkay, so I want to put it to you. So the person who asked the question says, I'd be interested if you could comment on Turkey's own expansion of citizenship stripping provisions on security-related grounds with the passing of Decree 680 in 2017. While Turkey is seemingly negatively impacted by citizenship stripping provisions of other states, what has motivated this dynamic in Turkey? And is Turkey part of the same broader paradigm? And are there similar concerns about the targeting of minority profiles?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, as I said, that's not an issue I've actually looked into from an analytical perspective, but especially after the coup attempt in 2016 in Turkey, we've seen on different fronts sort of securitization of certain sectors, also of, and this expansion of powers in the realm of citizenship stripping seems to also have been part of that. There have been, as far as I recall, have been instances of especially people accused of, terrorism membership being stripped of their nationality. So yes, so Turkey probably. So I guess since the coup attempt, has probably been also part of the strategy of sort of fighting different terrorist organizations in Turkey, and that Turkey sees as terrorist organizations, and also others. And so there has been a trend towards that, which could probably be read also as part of the global trend of moving towards this area to some extent. I wanted to add another point on sort of the Syria dimension. I think one thing we haven't really discussed much is how the security situation there is evolving, and how Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, might impact all of that. So because ISIS and ISIS cells there have been expanding in different ways, and attacks committed by ISIS in the different zones in Syria have also been increasing. So there's certainly an attempt of sort of regrouping and rejuvenation, both within Iraq and within Syria. And all the issues that we discussed today, sort of the security implications of citizenship stripping for people in camps, for people that have ended up in Turkey, or who may have gone back to their own countries through other ways. I think the security implications of that all need to be taken into account with the sort of evolving situation on the ground, where we are seeing security risks today increasing, especially in Syria and Iraq. And I don't think we're going to have the 2014-2015 moment again, where you had a lot of mobilization and transnational recruitment. So it seems like recruitment is happening more locally and regionally now within ISIS, also in the sort of ISIS branches in Africa, for example. But nevertheless, I think in overall, citizenship stripping practices are rendering these people more vulnerable to potentially also being exploited for recruitment and other things. I mean, the attack on the prison in Al-Hasaka a few months ago was sort of a telling example of the security risks involved. And we also know that there's still smuggling ongoing from the camps. So I think all of these security risks need to be taken into account. The Ukraine war, we don't really know how that is going to impact the situation in Syria, but you could imagine a scenario of less attention on security risks and counterterrorism efforts in Syria, which may potentially be exploited by ISIS and also other violent jihadists. So I think it's important to keep that context in mind as well when thinking about these issues, the security implications in the region.
Thank you very much, Berkay. So we have 4 minutes left, and I'd like to take this time to thank everybody for participating in this really important launch event, and also to again congratulate ISI and EUI for the publication of this truly groundbreaking report. And I thought that perhaps in closing, rather than have the final word, I'd like to invite our participants, our two presenters and two discussants, to reflect on the following. So You've all stated that an important innovation would be a moratorium on these kinds of measures. And I think the importance of that moratorium, you've made very clear why that would be an important development. But let's say we were to get a moratorium tomorrow, right? And states decided they're putting a moratorium. What do you think would need to happen next for us to move to a world where the human rights violations and the human rights concerns that are raised by reports would actually, we would be closer to substantively addressing them? I would imagine the moratorium is only a first step. So maybe each of you could reflect in closing on what we want to see after a world where we get a moratorium. And this is coming from a hopeful place that is imagining that this is something that might be on the horizon with the right kind of advocacy interventions. And perhaps we could go in the reverse order, have Berkay go first, Anne, and then Laura, and have Martin close us out. And just, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, it doesn't have to be too long. I'll turn it over to you, Berkay, first.
I think that this sounds like a very intriguing idea in terms of especially also ensuring that states exchange more information on best practices, trying to identify what the implications have been of the different policies they have been using against their own citizens, and if they're actually what concretely the security risks have been, if they have been amplified, or if there have been areas that have worked in accordance with what they have aimed for, if security goals they set for themselves have actually been served by these policies or not. Because I feel like there's not enough information that is being shared also on an interstate basis and on different platforms. So definitely it would be good to sort of reflect on, have a more realistic assessment of the security implications of this, and also exchange best practices on what works better or what needs to be improved in terms of policy response, especially towards citizens affiliated with ISIS. So that would be my initial reaction. Yeah.
Thanks, Berkay. Anne?
Sorry, couldn't find the unmute button there. So let me look at this from the perspective of Northeast Syria, because that's what I know and what I work on. Obviously, a moratorium is the first step, because that would enable repatriations. And we've always found that repatriations were, where they're possible, where voluntary and safe repatriations are possible, that is what must happen to answer the plight of those many individuals, women, children, and men who are currently detained in inhumane conditions in Northeast Syria. That being said, we also are very aware that for many of the individuals in the camps, repatriation is not an option, because returning would actually lead to more and other human rights violations. And the Special Rapporteur has been pushing for a global solution to be found for those individuals, because the security situation, the fluidity of the situation in Northeast Syria, the fact that it is controlled by unrecognized non-state armed groups is extremely problematic from both a security and illegal perspective. And then the last point that I want to make is repatriation is one thing, but accountability is another. Most of the individuals who are returned are tried for terrorism offenses, mostly membership and travel. Many of these individuals might not need to be tried. Some do, but also what we find quite disturbing is the difficulty in obtaining accountability for the most serious crimes that have occurred in the region. And so I think that a push for the prosecution of these more serious crimes to really have accountability and some sort of story writing of what actually has happened, who decided what, and how this happened, would actually have a very positive impact on ensuring that there's less, that you're actually working on the recruitment issue, on the violent extremism issue, and you're actually dealing with terrorism as a threat to global peace and security.
Thanks, Anne. Laura?
Yes, thank you. So I think a lot of these powers have been brought in by politicians who are very keen to show that they were tough on terrorism. And I think one of the things that we have to contest is that this is tough on terrorism, and really actually ask the question, do you want to be the generation of politicians that becomes known in the future for dumping the responsibility for your citizens on other countries and effectively losing sight and losing control of the longer term international security implications of that? So that's the question that I think we need to be putting across very strongly. And I think one of the other things that we must learn from is to not only draw on the human rights arguments and preserving the integrity of international norms that are so hard fought, but also to just take a closer look at what history has taught us about the use of this measure, in the short-term history, but also the longer-term history, and to listen to social psychologists who say that undermining people's sense of belonging is only going to potentially contribute to radicalization and that erosion of social cohesion. So I think we also need to be listening to the voices of other types of experts within this space and challenging our politicians to take the harder course of action, but the right one.
Thanks, Laura. And final word, Martin?
Yeah, thank you. So what I would say is, I would hope that this leads to a better reflection on the belonging element within citizenship. So I mentioned the distinction between, let's say, natural born and naturalized citizens, right? One distinction that we didn't address is between mono citizens and dual citizens. And these are discussions that are very much intertwined with citizenship deprivation, right? Norway accepted dual citizenship in order to be able to apply citizenship stripping. And that's, of course, exactly the wrong way of looking at this, right? There's a lot of research that show that from an immigration perspective, citizenship can be a positive step in life course and settlement trajectories. But conditional citizenship, of course, is exactly the wrong way, right? How can you make people part of society if you say, well, we make you a citizen now, but we might take it away, right? And yeah, I would hope that we would think